Hello, everybody, and welcome back for another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth, bringing you the latest updates from the war in Ukraine. In this episode, we're joined by Oleksandr Khara, Executive Director of the Center for Defense Strategies, Foreign Affairs and Security expert. But before we do that, let's watch this report about Ukraine over the past week.
Furious over his efforts to bring about peace in Ukraine fizzling out, U.S. President Donald Trump slammed Russia's Vladimir Putin, saying he was playing with fire. The comment follows some of the largest Russian drone and missile attacks on Kyiv since the beginning of the invasion. For his part, Putin said he would present a memorandum about a future peace accord to Kyiv at a new round of direct talks in Istanbul on June 2nd. The last Istanbul talks resulted in an exchange of POWs, contributing to this format's streak of efficacy. However, during a presser with Turkey's Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan on Friday, Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha stipulated that Kyiv would participate in the talks only if it saw a document setting out Russia's proposals for a peace deal in advance. 2 days later, on June 4th, the UK and Germany are scheduled to head a meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group at NATO headquarters. Meanwhile, adding to his Monday endorsement of Ukraine's right to launch long-range missile strikes into Russian territory, Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz said Berlin and Kyiv would develop a joint production of this kind of armament, no caps on range. Made during President Volodymyr Zelensky's visit in Berlin on Wednesday, the statement spurred speculations about deliveries of German-made long-range Taurus missiles to Ukraine, something that Merz's Chief of Staff Thorstein Frey did not rule out. The cooperation on the production of LRMs builds on a €5 billion military aid package Germany announced the same day. Among the reported highlights of the deal are new contracts for air defense systems, munitions, and logistical support, including maintenance infrastructure for the repairs of German hardware and anti-aircraft guns like Gepard and PZH-2000, as well as Starlink satellite communications. The package is also reportedly set to inject €400 million into the production of Ukraine's homemade drone missiles, BARS, offering a range of up to 800 kilometers. AN-196 drones boasting a range of up to 2,000 kilometers while carrying an up to 75-kilogram warhead, and Flamingo interceptor drones. Tuesday morning saw Russian drones hit a warehouse and missiles target a residential area in Sumy. One person was killed and another was wounded in the attack. Also this week, a Russian drone flew into a countryside checkpoint in the same region, wounding a police officer. In Odessa, drones targeted Ukraine's largest private postal operator, igniting a fire and damaging mail trucks. On Thursday night, drones struck a Kharkiv trolleybus depot. 11 people were injured across the region. These are part of a pattern of Russian drone attacks that have killed and injured civilians since July 2024 in an area stretching over 100 kilometers along the Dnipro's right bank in Kherson province. A UN inquiry report released Wednesday concluded the attacks constitute crimes against humanity. 303 is the number of prisoners of war that Ukraine managed to bring home on Sunday, concluding a three-phase operation of 1,000 to 1,000 prisoner exchange with Russia. This week, Russian forces captured the border villages in Ukraine's Sumy. The residents, according to a regional governor, had long been evacuated.
And joining us now is Oleksandr Khara, Foreign Affairs and Security Policy expert and Executive Director at the Center for Defense Strategies. Hello, Oleksandr, and thank you very much for joining us on Ukraine This Week.
Hello, Don. It's a pleasure to be on your program.
Yes, now, Kyiv declined to comment or to commit itself to attending peace talks with Russia on Monday, June 2nd in Istanbul. Kyiv has responded by saying that it was committed in principle to the search of peace at these talks, but it was waiting for a memorandum from the Russian side setting out their proposals, which was promised by Russia and Ukraine had still not received. Do you think this meeting will go ahead anyway there in Istanbul coming up on Monday?
Well, certainly it might, and the goal of Ukrainian side is first and foremost to show our American partners that we are serious about negotiations and that we put forward some proposals, first and foremost for a ceasefire. We don't believe that it's possible to have an end, to put an end to this war for various reasons. We can discuss it a bit later. And from the Russian point of view, they need to play the game with Mr. Trump because they managed to change his mind. And may I remind you that in the beginning, Americans pursued Ukrainians to agree on comprehensive and unconditional ceasefire. The Russians de facto rejected that. There was no a single day that they didn't shell Ukrainian cities and Ukrainian positions. And then after the phone conversation between Trump and Putin, Trump decided to make a U-turn. He didn't demand the ceasefire before the political talks may begin. And now we're in a place where we're talking to Russians, to the low-level delegation that doesn't have any responsibilities, any authority to decide the issues of peace and war. And the Russians are trying to play the Americans again and again. So there is no reason for us, to talk to Russians in general because they are not interested in good faith negotiations. But as I said, we need to show to Donald Trump that we are serious about these negotiations.
Exactly. So I 100% agree with you. Now, do you think that Ukraine is going to send such a high-level delegation as it sent last time to Istanbul? Or may it maybe downgrade it a little bit to kind of show the parity with Russia?
Well, I would send a lower level delegation. You're absolutely correct, because there is no reason to waste the time of the foreign ministry and defense ministry. Certainly, they have pretty much to do here in Ukraine. But we certainly we will react on the list of all those who will attend from the Russian side and what they are going to bring to this negotiation table.
Now, what are your expectations for the meeting? Do you think something will come out of it, or do you think that Russia will just continue to drag its feet and make unrealistic demands?
Well, they believe that they have resources and the environment is pretty favorable for them in let's say in two ways. First, they are preparing for a new offensive during this summertime, and it's the way how the Russians conduct negotiations. They relentlessly bomb Ukrainian cities and exerting pressure over Ukraine, and not just Ukraine. They're trying to blackmail our European partners with all those Wunderwaffe like Oreshnik and so on. And second thing, it's a lifetime opportunity for Putin to achieve his strategic goals. And this war is not just about territories of Ukraine or Ukrainian sovereignty, because it's important for the Russians, but it's about undermining the whole European security architecture. So they want to weaken NATO. They want to widen the rift between the United States and European partners. And they've been pretty successful in that, trying to explore this desire of Mr. Trump to do whatever is possible to put an end to this conflict regardless of the shape of Ukraine and the shape of European partners. It's clear that he is interested in solving issues in the Indo-Pacific and the Middle East, and he's not interested in Europe as it has been the case with previous presidents.
Now, Putin demands, I want to directly respond to this, have you respond to the situation concerning NATO. Now, Putin's demands is Ukraine's neutrality, no NATO, lifting sanctions and what have you. But really, when it comes down to it, who's responsible for NATO expansion? Is it NATO that is looking to expand eastward and position itself as close as possible to Russia? Or is it the countries that were formerly dominated by the Soviet Union or Russia that have legitimate security concerns and no longer want to be a part of that world that are seeking protection from NATO?
Well, you're absolutely right that, imagine the situation if Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria would not be in NATO. What Putin and people like him could have done to those countries. And I would say that it was not an expansion of NATO eastwards. It was an escape of those Central and Eastern European nations under the umbrella of NATO from the Russian threat. And they were right to do this. Secondly, the Russian propaganda is blaming the West that somehow they violated their word or agreement, which has never been in place in the first place. Mr. Gorbachev, the first and last president of the Soviet Union, said it clearly. There was no such an agreement, neither in words nor in written on paper. So what they are saying is not true. Secondly, if we're talking about Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, the Russians invaded Georgia and Moldova in 1990s. Before those countries proclaimed their European or Euro-Atlantic integration. So it was during the Yeltsin time, not Putin. Secondly, there was no real chance for Ukraine to become a NATO member after Russia invaded Georgia in August 2008. NATO didn't revoke the invitation or this clause that Ukraine and Georgia someday in the future will become members of NATO. But de facto, our partners, in particular Germany and France, they're against it and they were blocking this. And I should remind our listeners that back in 2014, when the Russians annexed Crimea and started a proxy war on Donbass, Ukraine was a non-bloc country with majority of Ukrainians against Ukraine's membership in NATO. So the Russians are trying to put a horse behind the carriage, and they are trying to justify their invasion with this NATO thing. And finally, Mr. Kellogg, General Kellogg, proposed for the United States to accommodate Russian interests and, as this case said, legitimate security concerns by denying Ukraine future membership in NATO. But it's not going to solve the main issue that Russia wants to expand. It wants to control not just Ukraine, but other nations, and even those who are now members of the European Union and NATO. So it's not going to solve the issue with Russia. And finally, Russia expanded its activities not just in Europe. In 2015, they take part in the Syrian civil war. The Russians are active in Libya now. They are active in the Sahel region and many other regions in the Middle East and Northern Africa. I haven't heard of any of those nations willing to join NATO. So it's expansionist, militarist, aggressive policies of the Kremlin that are the result of the war, not the expansion of NATO towards the Russian territory. And just one more thing. Finland and Sweden joined NATO recently. As a reaction to the Russians' activities in Ukraine in the war of aggression. And I haven't seen readiness of Mr. Putin to invade Finland, even though it's more than 1,000 kilometers of the shared border. And most importantly, it's a Kola Peninsula. The NATO infrastructure may put a check on the Russian nuclear arsenal in Murmansk port. So it's more, let's say, threatening to Russian security if NATO was aggressive bloc. That Finland become a member of NATO rather than Ukraine or Moldova or Georgia.
Yes, now we've seen Zelensky meet with Merz and Pistorius in Germany. Given that Scholz has repeatedly vetoed sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine and Merz is suggesting a rethink, do you think that Ukraine will potentially eventually get these missiles, these Taurus missiles? And we also heard from Merz saying that for probably several weeks now, that the limitations on the range of these weapons has been removed. I watched this press conference with Merz the other day and President Zelensky, And I know that one of the reporters asked about the potential delivery. Who knows? Maybe they've already been delivered to Ukraine. What are your thoughts?
Certainly we hope that we will have these capabilities and they may solve some of the problems on the battlefield. And I believe we should take off the carriage bridge. And I believe that Crimea is the center of gravity of this war. And if we can isolate Crimea from the Russian mainland, Putin can face a huge political dilemma. You know, the Russians inflated the importance of Crimea, and it's a sort of a religious relic that they possessed. And that is why just like to try this battleground in the future. Secondly, it's good that finally our European partners decided not to draw red lines in their own heads and provide Ukraine with some capabilities that we need. Had they provided us with missiles and other equipment, and particularly air power, back in 2022 or 23, this war might have been over. Because there was a momentum, and Ukrainian forces were expelling Russians from around the Kiev region and in the south and in the east. And at that time, unfortunately, our American partners decided to just to pause assistance, and they were restricting our ability to target Russian targets on their territory. So it's ridiculous, and it's not possible to win this war or to defend your country if you're not allowed to use all means that you have and to degrade the ability of the attacking country to come to your territory or to the trenches and then have an advantage. And finally, it was the Biden administration, even though we appreciate they started to help Ukraine and they provided huge amount of support, but these self-limitations pushed us into the war of attrition. And given the size of Russia, from demography and the industrial potential, and their de facto allies like China, Northern Korea, Iran, and some other countries, we're fighting this war of attrition, and it's not in our favor. We need to change that, and that's why we need some new capabilities, like missiles, like jets, like some other capabilities that will give an advantage to our defense forces on the battlefield.
Certainly. You've just brought up some new points I'd like to discuss, especially concerning about the U.S. approach. We heard about Senator Lindsey Graham and his sanctions bill against Russia, including banking, energy measures. Do you think that Trump will actually embrace this, or at least not obstruct it? Apparently, the Senate needs a green light from the White House first. And I guess the ultimate question is, how far will Donald Trump have to be pushed before he starts using the stick, if you will?
Well, if you have a look at the way how our partners been making decisions since 2014, and the algorithm is as such. The Russians commit a crime, like shutting down MH17, killing almost 300 passengers of this plane. And then there was a wave of really painful sanctions for Russia. And each and every time Russia commit horrible crime, our Western partners are doing something. And recently, Mr. Trump criticized Putin after 2 days of bombardment of the whole of Ukraine, in particular Kiev, with almost 1,000 drones and missiles. It was possibly the hottest nights in Kiev and in other cities for quite a long period of time. So I believe that Trump, his patience is running thin, and he may be in position to let's say, exert some pressure over his friend Putin. And I believe he is not naive now that it's possible to stop this war by exerting pressure over Ukraine. Because before before this time, every time Americans were criticizing Ukraine, and they were exerting pressure over Ukraine, like posing assistance, like trying to demand more and more concessions from Ukrainian side. But finally, they realized that Putin is not willing to do something. So I hope that he will he will recall this phrase and maxima that peace comes through strength, and the United States may have proper tools to push Russia to stop this war. But from the other hand, I don't believe that these sanctions may solve the issue. Even though they are pretty good on paper. But the whole idea of the sanctions so far has been that increasing pressure may change the behavior of Putin and Russia in general. While I believe the right approach could have been to degrade the Russian ability to fight by undermining the Russian economy. So the sanctions should not be just a diplomatic tool, but should be a tool of war rather than just increasing pressure on Russia.
Right. If we're talking about cards that one holds, well, that would potentially give the West a better card in their hand. And also, I think you hit the nail right on the head when saying that the West needs to take a proactive approach to this rather than a reactive approach, as traditionally it has been. Now, back to Germany, their new €5 billion military package. It includes funding for the production of long-range drones, for Iris-T air defense systems and vehicle repairs. I understand this as well to repair the German Gepards or the PZH-2000s. How will this really boost Ukraine's defense capabilities, though? And do you expect more attacks on Russian territory? How many such drones can Ukraine continue to produce daily that can produce these long-range attacks?
Just recently we attacked the far east of Russia. There were a couple of explosions, and I believe it's our military intelligence service has done this great job. And I believe that we are going to increase let's say, the damage that we cause deep into Russian territory. But from the other hand, drones are pretty good stuff. But we need more missiles. Drones can carry, let's say, 30 kilo of explosives, and drones can take off pretty easy targets. But if you're talking about buildings or fortified structures, the bridges and other things, we need missiles. And certainly, I would love to see Germans investing in Ukrainian missile production or development rather than just drones. Because we see that the Russians were able to scale up their production of Iranian-made Shahed drones. Mm-hmm. And if in the beginning of their use against Ukraine, they were, let's say, 20, 30 drones per day, now they are capable of sending 250 and more drones. And certainly they're not going to stop to produce in large numbers of these drones. And it's mean that we will be coping with all those missile defense systems and air defense systems that our partners provided us with. And you can imagine that is, calculus is not in advantage for Ukraine. Those missiles like Patriot interceptors or Iris-T, SMT, and some others, they are pretty costly to produce, and it takes time to produce. While the Russians are producing hundreds and hundreds cheap Shahed drones. Right. And it's difficult to shut them down, and particularly the Russians find a new way. They are trying to use them on the heights that our machine guns are not able to reach, and so we have some difficulties with that. The Russians are learning from mistakes and from their successes as well. So I would love to see this money come into missile programs that we need, and nobody would deny us ability to strike any target in Russia when we have our homegrown production and our own missiles.
Right, exactly. And I'd like to just follow up on that. Do you think that this announcement that there are no more range restrictions for Ukraine, what do you think this really means when Merce is saying this and saying that they are also going to invest in domestic production capability for Ukraine? Could this mean that certain components may be quickly sent to Ukraine to be able to give Ukraine its domestic production capability to make such missiles on a mass scale? Or do you think that these are 100% homegrown Ukrainian missiles?
No, I think the Germans will share technology and components with us, and there were several cases. But if I should mention that the United Kingdom is a champion in doing that, so they've been quietly helping our defense industry in various ways, and they are helpful from the first day of the war, and I would say from 2014, when the old European countries and certainly the United States were reluctant to provide a single bullet to Ukraine. The Brits were helping Ukrainian naval forces and Ministry of Defense and other structures. So I believe this combined effort of those awakened countries, and fortunately now we have Germany on our side, because before that Olaf Scholz was helping us for sure, but he had his own red lines in his heads, and possibly advised by the national security advisor that he inherited from the Merkel era. Fortunately, we have a new government that is more, let's say, more willing to step in and to step up with support to Ukraine. But certainly we need to invest into Ukrainian production. We have several types of missiles that were pretty successful. First and foremost, it's Neptune missile. It's actually the anti-ship missile, but we managed to convert it into the land-to-land missile. We are trying to extend its range according to the open source information up to up to 1,000 kilometers, and certainly with some assistance like the navigation modules, the communication modules that are resistant to electronic warfare. This type of weapons that we can produce, and they're going to be much cheaper than the Western produced missiles, and we need
Yeah.
a huge number to penetrate into Russia and to destroy command and control and other important centers that are helping Russia to exert pressure over our guys on the battlefield.
Yeah, and it's a shame that this wasn't done earlier, actually. Now, I'd like to move on. What's your take on Russia's demands for a buffer zone there in the Sumy region? They claim to have about 50,000 troops on the border there, and it looks like they're going to head towards Sumy. In hindsight, was going into Kursk a good idea? What are your thoughts?
Well, for sure, because for me, and I do not consider Kursk only from the military point of view. Certainly, at that time, there were several goals how to distract the Russian attention from the Eastern Front when there was a pretty dire situation. But there were some other goals that we achieved. Before the Kursk counteroffensive, the Western partners were reluctant to increase their assistance to Ukraine, because they thought that Ukraine is on a back foot and we are losing the battle, and it's better to have a compromise with Russia and so on and so on. But the Kursk offensive showed that we are capable of such an operation, and actually it was the operation or the way how would NATO fought the war with Russia. It was the combined, and it was maneuverable warfare. And secondly, which is really important, that the war is not just about killing your enemy and destroying its vehicles and weaponry and other things. A war is about converting military tools into political dilemmas for your enemy. And for Putin, it was quite a dilemma. Whether to accept that there is incursion into its territory, and according to the Russian law on defense, he should have called the general mobilization, should have ordered the defense forces, I mean the armed forces, to repel Ukrainian attack. And Putin decided not to take this step because the general mobilization would have undermined this so-called consensus between Russians and its rulers. That Russians are happy with their day-to-day life. They are not involved in the war. And those who want to get some money, they can, let's say, be mobilized or subscribe to the armed forces and go to Ukraine. So it was a political thing. And I believe it was the right thing to do. And talking about this buffer zone, certainly it's not about buffer zone. We are able to penetrate Russian air defense and strike as far as 1,000 kilometers deep into Russia. So we are not going to lose this ability, even if we lose some, let's say, 10 or 20 kilometers of other oblasts. But the most important thing for Russia is to capture some bits of Ukrainian territory from other than four oblasts that the Russians partially in control of. And then trying to convert into some advantages during the talks, but most importantly, to show to the Europeans and Americans that Ukraine is losing this war and it's not able to defend its territory. And that's why the West should exert pressure over Ukraine, and Ukraine should compromise not just those bits of territory, but its sovereignty in general.
Yes. Now, final question. What's your take on, or excuse me, final question. Russia made a big push from May 1st around Konstantinivka. How close is it to being encircled, basically? And what would the implications be for Donetsk Oblast and even for the city of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk?
Well, it's really painful for me. I'm native of Donetsk region, that actually Donetsk city that has been in Russian captivity since 2014, and Konstantinovka is a place that I traveled through to Kiev hundreds of times, and I know I have some friends from there. And it's important transportation hub, and certainly it's not just logistical, but a command and control center for Ukraine defenses. And threat to Konstantinovka is really, let's say, dangerous. But certainly, we're not going to lose the war if we lose those, let's say, bits of territory. It's tactical. It would be painful. It would be politically, let's say, uncomfortable for Ukrainian president. Certainly, our partners would be pushing Ukraine to negotiate with Russia something, ceasefire or the final resolution, and so on, so on. So, as I said, strategically, it doesn't change anything, even if we lose this town. But tactically, in our ability to defend the remaining parts of the Donetsk region would be under the threat. And certainly, I would not be happy to see Russian savages, destroying just another native city.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time in all those places during the war, and certainly would not like to see anything like that happen. But let's keep on holding out for hope and, of course, progress in the talks next week. Hopefully they can lead somewhere. Oleksandr Khara, Foreign Affairs and Security Policy Expert and Executive Director at the Center for Defense Strategies, thank you very much for being my guest today. We appreciate your insight. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Don.
And that's all the time we have on Ukraine this week. Join us again next week for all the latest developments from the war in Ukraine. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you then. Goodbye.